Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things that are written therein, for the time is at hand.
Preface. The period which this tale is designed to illustrate, though by sidelights rather than directly, is that of the Israelite kings David and Solomon. While not professing to give an absolutely exact picture of the times either in matters archaeological or historical, for a tale of this sort demands a certain freedom, the author trusts that his delineation gives broadly a true impression and one in accordance with the results of modern research. As to the story itself, he will be rewarded if it serves in however small a degree*ee to quicken the interest, especially of young people, in Old Testament history. Chapter I. Evil Tidings. It was after midnight, but the late dawn of early spring had not yet touched the east. The stars shone in full radiance, and under them glimmered faintly the white house roofs of Petra, remotest and most secure of all the fastnesses of Edom. In the dark hours, the city usually lay steeped in a profound silence, broken only by the querulous cry of jackals or the yelp of prowling dogs, but now there were many signs of wakefulness. Here and there in the dark streets torches flared up and vanished, the tramp of hurrying footsteps was heard and the clang of armor. For it was a time of war. The country had been invaded. At any moment, news of the most decisive character might arrive. The rumor ran that a messenger had just come in, and people began to gather thickly in the marketplace hoping to hear his tidings. By and by through the groups standing expectant there passed a sudden movement, with loud talking and gesticulating. "It cannot be true," cried one man, "we know the Israelites are across our border, but there has been no time for a battle, and our army cannot have been defeated." "May the gods send us better tidings," exclaimed another, "but I heard it from the lips of the runner himself as he left the palace." In the valley of Salt the two armies met, and the battle raged from early morning till noon. Our men fought like lions, but, when half of them were slain, they fled to Bozrah. Surely, put in a third, we shall quickly have tidings of another battle, and hear that those able Hebrews are driven out. So, from mouth to mouth, from house to house, the evil tidings flew, but the general feeling was not so much of panic as of intense rage and resentment. Their national pride was deeply wounded, for Edom had hitherto, at least since the days of the Horites, remained unsubdued by any foe. Everyone believed that the disaster could and would be retrieved, the loss of the battle was a mere temporary reverse. "Never," they cried, "shall the despicable son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, triumph over us. Never shall we yield to such a foe." Avho indeed, they argued, was this upstart David that they should stand in awe of him. No scion of a princely house, but a low-born man who had assumed the royal power by a bold stroke. After all, his quick elevation was not likely to be more lasting than that of the son of Kish. The tribes would never remain united under him, and the still powerful family of Saul would certainly oppose him. Besides, the Israelites were not a people to be afraid of, although they had conquered the soft and cowardly Canaanites. They would find a very different foe should they venture into the rock-girt strongholds of Edom. Nevertheless, in their secret hearts, the people of Petra could not but have some misgivings, so famous had the name of David ben Jesse grown. Not only was his personal prowess great, Shoiks, from boyhood in daring deeds, and later, conspicuously, in the slaying of Goliath, but now that he had forced his way to the throne, it was plain he possessed other gifts than mere strength of arm. With the greatest astuteness he had gained over to his side one great family after another among the 12 tribes, and even important adherents of the house of Saul, till it came to be generally acknowledged that the interests of the whole nation lay in submission to his rule. His famous band of warriors had expanded into a great, well-disciplined army, and, at short intervals, accounts had been coming to Edom of military successes that would have been incredible had they not been fully vouched by a crowd of fugitives. There was in fact a whole chapter of warlike achievements following close upon each other with unexampled rapidity. Hadadezer, king of Zebah, with his famous bodyguard, whose flashing golden shields were famous on many a battlefield, had fallen before him. The Philistines were driven back again and again. Damascus, rich with the spoils of many generations, had become his prey. The king of Hamath had chased a shameful servitude at the price of his vast hoard of silver and gold and BMSS. In Ammon and in Moab, one town after another had made terms with the conqueror, or had been pressed into surrender by famine, or was laid in ashes. Atrocious cruelties had been the lot of those who resisted, for it was David's policy to terrify others into submission by these spectacles of ruthless horrors. To the Edomites these rapid successes seemed almost due to some superhuman, some magical power. They knew that David ascribed them all to his God Jehovah, in whose name alone he tested, and the name of Jehovah, God of hosts, was terrible to the ears of all who knew the history of Israel. It was now Edom's turn to be attacked. David sought no pretext for invasion. It was enough that Edom was a near and warlike neighbor, without whose subjugation the king of Israel could never have a secure frontier. Besides, for centuries there had existed an ancestral feud between the peoples. According to an old legend they sprang from the same tribal fathers, but even before their birth as nations the twin brothers, Esau and Jacob, had struggled for supremacy. Their later history was at it not wanting in causes of jealousy and strife, arising out of their close neighborhood in a half-desert country with undefined boundaries. Now that Israel was asserting itself as supreme over its neighbors, a time of crisis had evidently arrived in which the long rivalry of Esau and Jacob must be finally decided in a struggle that would be likely, before it closed, to stain the red soil of Edom with the yet redder lifeblood of its sons. The Edomites were not unwilling to face the ordeal. A warlike race and incarnate to hardships by the nature of their country, surrounded on all sides by bare mountains and arid deserts, they were not to be terrified by fear of defeat. They knew too well what war was, nor did they lack the steady discipline of industry. Their land, so scorched and bare when looked at from outside, was not incapable of yielding fair resids to the diligent cultivator, for in the deep valleys it was well supplied with brooks and springs, and at certain seasons its uplands yielded abundant pasture. But what was of more importance, Edom possessed the advantage of sharing largely in the commerce that flowed from north to south and from south to north, between the Gulf of Elath and the Syrian kingdoms. Likewise it had a trade with Egypt, for in spite of all the petty wars continually going on, this was an epoch in which commerce was making rapid advances. Israel, indeed, held aloof, partly owing to the circumstances of its history, and partly from religious scruples, and until the time of Solomon it remained more backward in civilization than its neighbors. Edom, on the contrary, welcomed eagerly all the profit it could earn out of the free intercourse of the nations, and reaped no small advantage. With the great caravan route passing close by the gates of their cities, the Edomites were brought into contact with many other nations. Their cities became depots of commerce, and grew in extent and population far more rapidly than the natural resources of the country would have allowed. Yet, in spite of some habits of luxury introduced by foreign influence, the inhabitants remained unspoiled by wealth, and on the whole preserved unimpaired the hardy vigorous character of their ancestors. Hence the men of Petra were able to meet with fortitude the alarming intelligence that their army had suffered defeat and that the Israelites must have already pushed far into their country. Bozrah their capital would doubtless be enduring a siege, and it was possible that a portion of David's army might even be on the march towards their own gates. Let the worst come, they said, we shall fight and die for our God and our country. Never shall we yield like cowards. And, in truth, anyone who should have dared to suggest the prudence of making terms with the enemy would have risked being torn in pieces. Both old and young, so soon as the evil tidings reached them, began to busy themselves with all kinds of preparations in expectation of a possible attack on their town. The women collected and ed the treasures in secret hiding places. The men were busy at the work of barricading and strengthening the gates and taking measures for the defense of every possible way of access to the town. Everyone, too, sought out and put in order whatever weapons or accoutrements he happened to possess. Smiths and armorers were hastily urged to yet more incessant labor than had been forced upon them for some weeks before. The sound of their ringing blows was heard long before daylight in every street, and they had much to endure from the impatience of their customers. At one forge, situated close under the cliff on the east side of the town, were gathered a small group of soldiers evidently of high rank. Most of them held spears or swords. One carried a helmet, another a breastplate. Their stalwart figures were wrapped loosely in striped woolen garments thrown over their closely girt tunics, and their long bushy hair escaped from under their simple headgear of white or striped cloth confined by a cord. Their bearded faces all bore the stamp of men bound to command, and as they stood together discussing the absorbing topic of the hour their dark eyes flashed, lighting up their fine straight-featured faces and full-lipped mobile mouths. The forge, originally cave dwelling of the aboriginal Horites, was large and roomy. Near the center blazed two fires fitfully blown up by rude bellows, and beside them at their anvils three broad-shouldered smiths, naked but for their loincloths, wielded their hammers, turning about the weapons they were repairing. As the sparks flew and the flames shot up, the red-streaked sooty roof was weirdly lighted up, and fantastic shadows came and went with sudden movements, now bright, now dark, as if fire demons of the mountains were carried wrestling together in mortal combat. Near the mouth of the cave, and a little apart from the others, stood a man and a young boy. The man, whose tall, spare figure was closely wrapped in a dark robe, looked past middle age, for his beard was touched with white and his face was strongly lined, especially round the deep sunk eyes, yet his upright, dignified carriage and commanding look showed no trace of the feebleness of age. He waited with manifest impatience, but the little fellow of 5 or 6 who held fast by one hand to his guardian *S robe watched the flying sparks with eager, wide-opened eyes. He was dressed exactly like the others, only he wore a closely fitting cap richly embroidered. His bright, intelligent look and the high breeding unconsciously displayed in his innocent gestures, would have drawn attention anywhere, and it was evident that the child was an object of special notice to the warriors standing by. His guardian Lawton, Cham. Berlin or steward of the royal palace in Petra, was not unobservant of the glances so frequently directed towards his little charge, and his quick hearing enabled him to catch a few words of the conversation, purposely carried on in a low tone so as not to reach his ears. What he heard did not please him, for he flashed a look of indignation at the group from under his knitted brows. "Yes, the chances of war," said one speaker. "Suppose the king falls and his eldest son, then, Alvin will have to take the lead, and if the gods favor him, he may be king, for his elder brother Carrot's children are too young, and who knows but that child there may be king of Edom one day." "Who knows," replied another, "it may come about in those days of war sooner than anybody thinks." "The gods forbid," added a third, "for is it not a saying, woe to the land that is ruled by a child?" "Well, in that case," put in the second speaker, with a light laugh and a significant glance at a strong-built young man, rather darker-skinned than the others who had not yet spoken, that case some other than a child might take the reins. This direct hint brought no response save a slight shake of the head, but there was at the same time a momentary lighting up of the young fellow's face that showed the idea suggested was familiar and not displeasing. For Hori, as he was named, had claims to a position rather different from his fellow officers. He traced his lineage back to the chieftains of the old race, and his family was also related, by intermarriage, to the reigning dynasty. His prowess as a warrior was eminent, yet he had not been allowed, as he wished, to join the army in the field, for his pretensions to an almost equal rank with the king, too openly avowed, had aroused the royal jealousy, the more so that Hori had, as hereditary chief of Siyain tribes in the Moimdans, considerable power to back him. He was now a little inclined to regard the king's defeat as a deserved penalty for having slighted him, though he was not so base as to look forward to his own advancement at the price of humiliation to his coimtry. The little boy, Hadad, only son of Alvin, the second son of the king, did not seem a very danger. Us rival if others were removed, but as yet nothing seemed less likely than that he should be placed in such a position as would excite the ambition and envy of others. Lawton now turned to the armorer, impatiently bidding him make haste and not keep them waiting. It appeared, however, that the piece of work he wanted done could not be so speedily finished, so he took the boy's hand and turned to go. "Come," he said, "let us up to the cliff top and see whether the watchman has news, for the day must be breaking." Hadad would gladly have stayed, but looking up at the steward's face, he saw there so anxious and stern an expression that he did not venture to speak, but ran along at his side. For a short distance they followed the street in which they were, until it met a somewhat wider road, on both sides of which rose high cliffs, narrowing rapidly as they advanced, till they met a wild, dark gorge with many windings and sudden turns. At their feet the ripple of a brook was heard in the darkness, flowering sprays of oleander brushed against their faces as they passed along the dusty road, and sweet odors of flowers came to them from the margins of the brook and from the rift rocks. Turning sharply off from the main road, they entered suddenly a narrow ravine, almost a mere cleft in the steep face of the rock, where they began to ascend by a rough stair, cumbered at first by trails of ivy and of the green caper plant, but higher up, quite bare and free of vegetation. When they emerged at the summit, they saw before them a grassy platform of some extent, thickly besprinkled with flowers, and at one corner, standing on the summit of a high isolated crag, a solitary watchman, his motionless figure like a statue against the dark sky. In response to Lawton's greeting, this man reported that all was quiet as yet, but that by sunrise there would certainly be some tidings. Lawton answered with a sign, and proceeded to climb up to the watchman S station. Here, they were in sight of another sentinel, who, again, was within hail of the outposts on the northern road, by which news from the seat of war must arrive. Hadad meanwhile remained below, playing among the flowers, plucking them and winding them about. A gold chain he wore round his neck. This ornament, to which an amulet was attached, had been presented to him 2 years before by an Egyptian lord who had come from Tanis along with an envoy. He had stayed some time at Petra, hunting among the mountains with the king of Edom and his friends. By way of acknowledging the hospitality shown him, Abuna had given many gifts, and among them, the necklet to the bright little fellow, scarcely more than a baby, who had taken a fancy to the stranger. "This pretty thing, carrot," he said, "will bring you luck. See. It is marked with magical signs, and each of the stones in the gold setting has a virtue of its own, and so Hadad had worn it ever since." As the day began to dawn, a wonderful panorama came into sight before and around the lofty plateau where the boy played among the grass and flowers. The vast masses of Mount Hor stood out clearly against the pale sky, in which the stars were now fading. Range beyond range, like some colossal rampart raised by Titans, flat-topped, row-immed hills, rose in frowning majesty, and beyond and among them, serrated ridges and sharp peaks. As the light increased, the strange colors for which Edom is famous began to come out. The nearer hills, mostly of a reddish, rusty hue, were streaked in places with dull gold where yellow sandstone cropped out. Here and there limestone strata lent a bright, high light, and everywhere the vast hills were rent and seamed and torn into cracks and fissures and gaping clefts, and their slopes were strewn with innumerable fragments small and great. The rich color of the scene came almost entirely from the rocks scorched for ages by the sun and torn by the force of wild torrents. Only in a few places the verdure of cultivated land and bushes was to be seen. After a little the boy had tired of his flowers, and he was now peering over the edge of the cliff *, whence he could safely look into the city, which filled nearly the whole extent of the uneven rocky basin in which Petra, walled in by mountains, lies like a pearl within an eyed oyster shell. Through the middle of the town from the marketplace ran one street broader than the others. It led to the mouth of the deep gorge to the east, which formed the usual and most easy entrance to the town. From this main street, but leading southwards, another road, rougher and less direct, but still practicable, branched off through the mountains. Both these issues were now thronged with a bustling, jostling crowd of men and beasts of burden. The merchants, dreading to be imprisoned by a siege, were hurrying their caravans southward to Eziongeber and Elath. Most conspicuous was a long string of camels laden with bulging bales of provender and merchandise, and following them came a string of asses heavily laden with unwrought iron and the iron parts of weapons. The boy could hear the shouts of the drivers urging on the slow beasts. Other sights more homely also attracted his attention. Women preparing the early meal, goatherds leading out their flocks to pasture, yet of all the sights he saw, his quick eye followed with most interest the soldiers pacing to and fro in the street. Immediately below him carried archers with their bows, lancers with their long, broad-pointed spears, and sometimes a man in armor. Suddenly a cry of delight escaped him as he noticed a two-horse chariot, gay with gold and silver ornaments, rattling up the street at a great pace. The driver, richly dressed in a many-colored robe with gold ornaments, was a young man of slight but firm build. He stood alone in the chariot and gaily touched up the steeds with the whip. Hadad knew him instantly. It was his father Alvin, and he watched him disappear in the direction of the palace. Again, among the women in the street he picked out his nurse Basemath, and saw with mischievous glee that she was questioning everybody she met and looking up and down in quest, he was sure, of himself. He cried out her name and waved his hands, but she did not look up. At this moment his attention was diverted to Lawton and the watchman, who both at once uttered an exclamation, and changing their position gazed intently towards the desert, where they could see another sentinel bending forward with outstretched neck, his hands shading his eyes as he scanned the distant horizon. A moment more and he leaped back with a wild, piercing cry of alarm, a cry instantly caught up and repeated by the man at Lawton's side, and re-echoed by other watchmen posted at various points around the city. A few seconds later came another cry, and in a shrill, harsh voice a message was chanted across the waste: "Behold fugitives, and behind them the army of Israel. The enemy is at our gates." Carrot at once Lawton, girding his robe more tightly around him, sprang towards the boy, snatched him up in his arms, and rushed headlong down the rocky stairway, and as he reached the bottom took the nearest way to the palace. He had not gone far before he overtook Basemath, who as soon as she saw him began to reproach him volubly for carrying off her charge, but he pushed the boy towards her crying, "Hasten to the palace. Avarn the prince that the army of Israel is at hand, fugitives are coming in, and he shall have tidings shortly." So saying, he turned and ran swiftly towards the gorge leading up to the eastern gate so as to meet the first messengers from the north. Basemath, with a wild cry of alarm, flew in the opposite direction to the palace, dragging the boy after her. Chapter 2. The enemy at the gate. The palace of Petra had little outward show. It was a long low building flat-roofed, and set close under the cliffed asterisk at the west side of the town. The walls were pierced externally by a very few small and carefully latticed openings. Within, there were two spacious courts adorned with shrubs and cooled by refreshing fountains. The most curious part of the house was invisible from the outside, namely, a vast cavern extending far into the mountain. It was entered by a low-browed archway, above which, at a considerable height, a rude aperture had been tunneled so as to light the outer compartment of the cave, used as a sort of armory or arsenal. It was here that Basemath found Prince Alvin busy among piles of polished shields and spears, selecting an equipment for his own special bodyguard, for he occupied the palace as governor of the city. His men stood around him assisting him in his task, and on one side, waiting to be served with a fresh supply of arrows, stood a troop of some 50 wiry mountaineers. The woman, disregarding all ceremony, burst in upon them in the dim light, with her wild and breathless cry, "The Israelites are upon us, they are here, within our very gates. Lawton sent me to give you warning." At her words, to which her wild and disheveled appearance seemed to lend confirmation, every man grasped the nearest weapon and rushed out into the street. There, they quickly saw that something exciting was happening, for many others like themselves were rushing out seeking more definite information. Alvin directed his steps towards the eastern gate, and he had not gone far before he met his faithful old steward rushing quickly towards him, but with every mark of sorrow and dismay, his face ghastly, his limbs trembling. "I bring ill tidings," he said, "ill tidings to the house of Edom. Bozrah is fallen, the citadel torn down, the palaces burnt with fire, and would that my lips had not to utter it. Nahat the king, thy father, is slain in battle, Zareth thy brother is slain, his children murdered, and thou, O Alvin, art king of Edom." Then, covered with dust as he was, and weeping bitterly, the old man bowed himself down at Alvin's feet and made obeisance. Then raising himself he uttered with trembling lips the royal salutation, "May our God save and preserve King Alvin, the life of Edom." Alvin stood for a moment stupefied and scarcely realizing what was said to him, and perhaps, of it all the thing that most pierced him with a sense of hopeless ruin was the ill-omened greeting of old Lawton. He was king, but with a desperate battle before him, and nothing but a routed army to help him to win it. Nevertheless, though shaken by the fearful catastrophe, Alvin was not overwhelmed. The very announcement of the deaths of his father and brother and the massacre of his kindred, set aflame in his heart an instant desire for revenge. The spirit of his ancestors awoke within him and made him equal to the moment which, as he instantly saw, was not one for idle lamentation, but for action. Involuntarily he muttered, "May the curses of all the gods fall upon Israel and on the robber son of Jesse." Then turning to Lawton, after a moment's thought he cried, "Come, we must avenge the slain, not weep for them. Let us go in and take counsel how best to meet the enemy." Returning to the palace, the king summoned the officers of his bodyguard, and through them issued orders for the defense of the town and for the calling out of every man capable of bearing arms. As if to show how earnest and grave the crisis was, Alvin now cast from him his rich and glittering attire, and donned instead a coat of mail with a helmet of bronze. Then he girt on his sword, and grasped his spear, with the resolute air of a man on whom rests the fate of a brave people. Issuing from the palace, the king drove quickly in his chariot, attended by an retinue of soldiers, to the spot where, near the mouth of the ravine leading up to the eastern entrance, the facade of a rudely primitive, yet imposing, temple stood high up on the side of the cliff. Ascending the steps and passing beneath the red pillars, he was received at the door by the priests who, bowing low before him, conducted him within. The interior was almost dark, for the temple was hewn out of the living rock, and all about its dimly discerned pillars floated wreaths of incense, filling the place with a faint yet penetrating odor. In the farthest recess, out of a background of deep darkness, rose the awful image of Edom's chief god, a god severe and stern as the mountains he guarded, yet gracious to those who served him. Never before had he received such fervent prayers as his worshippers were now pouring forth at his throne. Alvin, perhaps, most of all, waited as he was with a teetable responsibility, invoked his God with the deepest earnestness, praying him to come and save his country. Next, he arranged with the priests for the offering of liberal sacrifices, making a vow at the same time to reward the god with rich gifts if he should deliver them out of their present distress. Finally he received the formal homage of all the priests, and having thus propitiated the powers of the unseen world, descended to his chariot, and leaping in, lashed on his horses, so that they sprang forward at the gallop up the smoothly paved ravine towards the eastern gate. For this wonderful pass, winding like a river between perpendicular rocks for about a mile and a half, was carefully paved, the brook being led in a stone channel cut through the rocks. At one side, no stranger entrance, nor one promising easier defense, could be conceived. The cliffs, rising to the height of from 1 to 300 feet, are, like all the rocks of the region, seamed and rent, but in the shade of the deep gorge, the crevices are filled with a luxuriant growth of creeping plants. Here and there on the less steep spots patches of oleander bushes and of grass intermingled with flowers gave now, in springtime, an almost gay appearance to the richly colored rocks, yet the prevailing impression of the gorge was of mystery and gloom. As the king advanced he had to slacken his pace, for the road was full of people and soldiers hurrying forward in the same direction. At every turn the crowd became denser till he had to advance at a walking pace. It was a strange scene in the narrow pass, with one glimpses of the bright blue sky above shining through the tufted verdure, and the mass of excited people, shouting and talking, in the deep shadow below. It was soon apparent why their advance was so slow, for presently another stream of people, coming in the opposite direction, began to filter through. They were mostly country people, many of them driving before them herds of goats and cattle, but also, among those who had passed the gate, and were pushing on to the city, were not a few men visibly fresh from the battle, blood-stained, wounded and torn. They limped along dragging their weary limbs, all of them covered with dust, ghastly, with disheveled hair and staring, hollow eyes, stumbling and falling as they went sheer fatigue, after the long desert road, and the toilsome ascent up from the lower country. The gravity of the situation became more and more apparent to the king as he marked the disheartening effect of this dismal train, who spread, as they went, the disastrous news of the king's death, and the lost battle, and the hopelessness of the struggle. Dark stern countenances, as they listened, grew. Many of them, only fiercer and darker, but on too many faces Alvin plainly read panic and despair. His own heart sank within him as, for the first time, he realized the extent of the disaster, and how he would have to fight not only against the enemy outside but against the fears and cowardice that were taking possession of people's minds. Although he kept his brave resolute look, shouting as he passed a word of encouragement and hope to the fugitives, and bidding them not dishearten others, yet, in truth, the imminence of the peril seized hold of himself, and he almost lost, for a moment or two, his self-possession. Hitherto he had lived a life of pleasure, hunting among the mountains, feasting in the cities, taking at times a subordinate part in some raid against a neighboring tribe, but now, for the first time in his life, he was thrown entirely on his own resources. All his energy, and skill, and boldness, would scarce be enough to carry him through, and he was conscious that he had not overmuch wisdom to meet the demands of the hour. One thought especially vexed him. Not long before he had had a quarrel with Hori, whose poi would now be of especial value, as he was popular in the town, and could besides, summon to his side at a word more than 1,000 of the wild hill tribesmen, who lived on the outskirts of Edom and hardly acknowledged its suzerainty, though to Hori, whom they considered their chief, because of his descent, they were ardently devoted. For though his family had been for 2 generations essentially Edomite, yet a certain jealousy of the intruding race had connived in it as an inheritance, and this feeling had recently been aggravated by Alvin, who had taunted Hori with his descent from a conquered and ousted clan. Alvin had now arrived at the gate where he found a scene of great confusion. Fugitives were pouring in. The townspeople were seizing upon them to get, if possible, some information about what had happened, and the probable fate of their friends in Basra. It was necessary to clear the way and send the incomers back to the town, and also to partially shut the gates so as to admit none but friends. The gateway was solidly built, with 2 projecting towers, between which, in a recess, the actual gates were hung, heavy massive constructions of wood and metal fastened by huge bars, The space inside at the termination of the road was large enough to hold some 400 or 500 people. Here Alvin found many of his officers, and busied himself in giving orders. From a wounded soldier, just come in, he learned that King David himself, though present, had not taken an active part in the war. His army was led by his two great generals, Joab and Abishai, and the strength of the force likely to be brought to Petra was not more than 10,000 men. If he had had more time, Alvin thought he might have risked a battle in the open, but now it was too late, and he must concentrate all his efforts on the defense of the city. Just as he was proceeding to arrange for the best disposition of the troops at his disposal, he was surprised to see coming up from the town a compact body of archers, marching two, and defiling into the space he had cleared behind the gate, and at their head marched Hori. The new king's anxiety about the loyalty of this subject of his was, in fact, groundless. Hori, even more than the king, felt himself bound to sacrifice everything for his native soil, and he was of too generous a nature to allow a private grudge to interfere with the public safety. No sooner, therefore, did the news reach him of the reverses that had taken place than he sent out swift messengers through the town to raise his adherents, and dispatched others into the mountains to summon the clans who owned him as chief. With the men he had collected he marched to the palace, intending to be among the first to do homage to the new king, but finding him gone to the eastern gate, he followed him thither. Hori's men were all thorough children of the desert and of the mountains, spare wiry figures, darker skinned, and rather lower in stature than the Edomites, and with a savage air about them, especially in their wild dark eyes. They were well known to have no equal in scaling the cliffs, on which their feet were swift and sure as those of the gazelle. The king, meanwhile, was looking a little doubtfully at Hori, not quite sure whether the phalanx of bowmen at his back was intended as a menace, but no sooner had the Horite chief arranged his troop than he stepped frankly forward towards Alvin, and bowing low before him, highly for him as the king. "O king," he said, pointing to the archers, "behold thy servants. Our hearts are as thy heart, to fight for our country. Command thy servants as seemeth to thee good." At these words Alvin's brow cleared, and his face was lighted up with a joyous smile. Taking Hori by the hand, he led him to his chariot, and bade him stand beside him while he should address the soldiers and the people. The two young men, in all the vigor and beauty of youth, set off by their martial accoutrements, had instantly all eyes fixed upon them. It was known that they had been enemies, and the spectacle of the two putting aside private enmity for the sake of their country was at once hailed as a good omen. There was something, too, that touched the wildest and fiercest there, in the sight of these two brave youths, who might tomorrow be lying slain on the battlefield, facing duty so nobly, and inspiring older men with courage. A loud shout greeted the king as he signified his wish to speak. "Men of Edom, he began, the dark and sorrowful tidings that have made me king are known to you all, but do not let them make your hearts faint within you. It is true, the Beni Israel, on whom may our gods rain curses and disaster, have by surprise defeated our army and taken Bozrah. So is the swift-footed gazelle surprised by the archer when it descends to the plains, but it is safe on the high hills, and we are safe in this our mountain fastness. What enemy has ever entered, or ever can enter, to the heart of Petra? We have but to guard the passes which the gods have made impregnable. Let us then stand together, all as one man for our native land, for our beloved city. As your king, I expect from all that loyal and ready allegiance of which Hori has given the example. Be brave as your fathers of old. Never must Edomite bow his head in surrender. Never must Edomite be led into slavery, least of all to the upstart son of Jesse and his band of robbers. Rather will we die. Our cause is just and holy. Our God will fight for us. He will grant us the victory." As he ended there arose on all sides a great shout. "Long live King Alvin, Carrot and the soldiers clashed their weapons against their shields and waved their swords on high. The shouting was taken up by the crowd hurrying back to the town, and all the way down the long gorge the cry was echoed and re-echoed from the lofty cliffs, "Long live King Alvin!" Again presently, when the king returned to the city with Hori still beside him, the same joyous shouts passed from street to street into the very heart of the city. It was the king's best consecration. Henceforth there was an end to confusion or panic, confidence was restored, and everything that the instant danger required was done as quickly and efficiently as possible. Hori had advised that the whole of the long pass should be guarded by archers, who should also be prepared to hurl down rocks upon the enemy if he passed the gate, and this advice was followed, but only partially, near the gate. The nature of the crags, loose and toppling, made it difficult to approach near enough to the edge to carry out this design properly, and also their summits were inaccessible from below for the greater length of the gorge. It was, however, the opinion of almost all that the gates could never be stormed, but if they were broken through, the next effectual point of defense would be at the entrance of the city. Consequently little was done except to post archers on every available piece of standing room on the sides of the gorge. The gates were now finally closed and barricaded. They had but to await the arrival of the foe. Chapter 3. The Gauguin's blood. It was the policy of King David to swoop down on his prey like the eagle, and to strike rapidly and fiercely. He had learned during the years he spent as an outlaw in the deserts and caves of Engedi and Adullam how to move his followers swiftly and silently from one part of the country to another. All possible shifts and stratagems of war were familiar to him and his band, and now for some months, with supreme confidence in his own skill and audacity, he had been carrying out the same policy of swift and daring attack on a much larger scale, and he had been thoroughly successful. In the war with Edom he had secured the first victory. The Edomites had been routed in the Valley of Salt, though not without frightful carnage and equal losses to both sides. David himself along with Job had laid siege to Bozrah, while Abishai had penetrated further into the country laying it waste. Bozrah was taken at the first assault by the sheer reckless daring of David's men, and the king now returned home leaving the two warlike brothers to push the campaign which it was anticipated might be prolonged for months, there being no hope of the Edomites giving in, and Petra in particular being well known as an almost impregnable stronghold. Job and Abishai pushed on accordingly, driving before them vast numbers of soldiers and peasantry who hoped to find refuge in the mountain citadel. These two generals were well fitted for such an enterprise. Of overbearing and insolent temper and yet always of one mind, the brothers pursued their determined course with the persistency of bloodhounds following up a trail, but carried ISO when it came to fighting, with the daring and courage of lions. Idishing on their prey. Job, in particular, was a man of irresistibly commanding character, a man his soldiers would obey and follow though they did not love him. Even the king himself often dared not oppose the will of his general, and would even sometimes have been glad to dispense with his imperious nephew's services had they not been absolutely necessary for the stability of the kingdom. For Job, in spite of all his brutality, was undoubtedly a great general, able both in the planning and in the carrying out of a campaign, and never foolishly persistent in a predetermined course, but ready to change his tactics according to circumstances. Needless to say, he was not a religious man in the same sense as King David, who, in spite of the temptations of absolute power, preserved a conscience that could be reached and was endowed with finer sympathies than were common among his people at that period. Yet Job's religion had a powerful effect on his deeds. It was in fact an even stronger motive power with him than his devotion to his royal nephew. He was, in truth, a fanatic in his devotion to Jehovah the God of battle, but this did not exclude that his God might be served not only by deliberately waged war, but likewise by cold-blooded murder and assassination. This was the man who, with his like-minded brother, Abishai, and a large army at their back, was now storming at the rocky portals of Petra. Already for more than a week they had lain encamped in the arid desert plateau outside, and the army was beginning to suffer much from the intense heat by day, and the equally intense cold by night, as well as from the privations and discomforts inseparable from such expeditions. Job himself was beaming with impatient wrath. Again and again he had tried an assault upon the gates, but always he was driven back with loss. In many directions he had endeavored to find a path over the cliffs into the town, but the enemy's scouts were found always on the alert. To take the gate seemed an impossibility, so vigilantly was it guarded. On their part the Edomites continued to strengthen their defenses, and Hori-Karat's corps of archers, posted high on every coign of vantage above and around the gate, were especially galling to the Israelites, whose approaches, whether made stealthily or in sudden rushes, were invariably met with such a rain of well-directed arrows that retreat became inevitable. Job, exasperated as he was by this long-continued check, was all the more determined that the place should be taken. He and Abishai held many a consultation, but at last Job thought that he had lighted upon a plan that might be successful, though it was one which in his experience he had seldom found of use. He had been to the front examining, so far as he could, the mode in which the gates were fortified. Outside, they were covered with plates of metal as a defense against fire, the approach being flanked on both sides by positions occupied by the enemy's archers. He noted that above the gates on the inside, there was a wooden erection of platforms resting on heavy beams, upon which archers were stationed. This suggested to his mind the plan of shooting into and over the gates a thick flight of arrows tipped with blazing pitch, as well as, at the same time, applying a huge pile of combustibles below the gates themselves. Preparations were accordingly made for an assault at nightfall, when the enemy could not aim their deadly arrows with such certainty. The soldiers of Job advanced with piles of thorns and bushes, and everything they could collect that would bum. With a rush they dashed forward to the gate and placed them in position. Immediately behind came the bowmen with their arrows ready to shoot, and other soldiers carrying lighted embers for each rank of men. It was a dangerous attempt, but Job himself led them, so that, though many fell, there was no giving way. The pile of firewood was set alight, and roared up crackling against the gate, and at the same moment a fiery flight of arrows was discharged. The result was more successful than Job expected. By some carelessness a mass of thorns that had been cut down in erecting the additional defenses, had been thrust down close to the end of a beam. The thorns caught fire, and the dry wood was soon in a blaze. The great fire outside did little damage, but the flames spread rapidly within, so that the Edomites were seen leaping down from their platform above the gate to escape burning. Wild shouts now arose among the men of Israel, and bringing forward scaling ladders, they set them against the gate, the fire there being nearly burned out. With incredible hardihood men climbed up and hurled themselves through the blazing woodwork, into the midst of the foe, but it was only to be borne back into the flames by the spears of the Edomites massed behind. But Job was not the man to hesitate at the sacrifice of 100 or so of brave men if he could gain his point. So the Israelites were still pressed on to mount the ladders, to dash through the flames, and to fall pierced by savage spear thrusts. The Edomites could not throw down the ladders because of the fiercely burning fire, but from the flanking towers, they still kept up a most galling fire. Besides, from the overhanging cliff, and from the top of the square towers, they hurled down huge stones and fragments of rock, smashing in this way two of the ladders, and crushing their burden of men, whose shrieks pierced through the wild battle cries shouted on both sides. Alvin, at the head of his spearmen, dashed forward again and again, but the fiercely blazing dry timber was a foe none dared face. Nor could they reach the gates for more than a few seconds. For the same reason, the Israelites were forced to hold back, abandoning their comrades who had leapt the barrier to their dreadful fate. It was clear, however, that the device of Job had been completely successful, and that Jehovah had once more delivered the enemy into the hand of Israel. The gates themselves were now on fire, their metal plates, heated to a white heat, could be seen straining and curling back as the wood split and brunt beneath them. The moment for a successful assault had come. Job instantly seized it, for he saw how easy it would be for the enemy to erect a fresh barricade in the narrow pass. Accordingly, putting himself at the head of his own band of picked men, all clad in mail and armed with swords and javelins, he led them forward. Pushing before them the binning, tottering wreck of falling gates and beams, they dashed in, but only to meet a compact mass of equally resolute warriors, face to face. Shouting their battle cry, "The sword of the Lord and of David," they cast their javelins and rushed upon the enemy in a fearful hand-to-hand conflict. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they pressed them back into the gorge, trampling upon the slain and dying. And all the time, from above, came hurtling down giant masses of rock that broke and splintered as they fell, and from the same quarter arrows were shot down thickly, searching out the joints of the mail-clad men, and piercing many with deadly wounds. The Edomites had not sufficiently realized the possibility of the gate being burst through, and had but slackly provided the easy means of defense offered by their perpendicular cliffs. It was only for a short distance at the east end of the gorge that rocks had been gathered to hurl down on the foe. Consequently, 100 yards farther on, the Israelites were relieved from this danger, and the contest was more equal, or rather, owing to the nature of the ground and to the confusion and dismay caused by the taking of the gate, the forces of Job had the advantage. It was a long fight. Hour after hour, in that long, winding, deep gorge, the struggle went on, hand to hand. At first every inch was contested, but as Job made good his advance, the Edomites were gradually thrown into confusion. They could not escape to the rear, for fresh troops were always coming up, but hampered as they were, they fought bravely. Hori had taken care to post his archers on every available fissure and cleft of the pass all down its 1.5 mile long extent, and these men helped immensely to retard the advance of their foe. Taking deliberate aim, and themselves out of danger, they picked off many of Job's bravest. He himself received a wound in the neck, though not a deadly one. It only infuriated him, as a lion is infuriated by the hunter's darts. At that moment he was face to face with Alvin, and they had already dealt each other many furious cuts and blows, but the youth was no match for the veteran. Inflamed by the pain of his wound, Job rushed upon him, and with one terrific blow broke through his guard, and cleft his helmet in twain. Alvin fell dead and bleeding at his feet, and was trampled down by the oncoming soldiers. This was the crisis of the battle. Inspired by their captain Carrot's prowess, the Israelite warriors pressed on down the pass with a rush that was irresistible, while the fall of their king threw the Edomites into still greater confusion, and caused many to cast away their weapons and flee. But most stood their ground. Once and again they rallied, and the narrow pass, now running with blood, was the scene of a frightful life and death wrestle between the combatants. At last, the Edomites gave way, but in that awful gorge choked with men and packed at the city end with soldiers pressing forward, unaware of what was happening in front, no escape was possible. Huddled together in wild confusion, they were slaughtered like sheep by the Israelites, who literally hewed their way through a compact mass of living men. Gradually, however, the panic spread to those farther down the pass, and the brilliant army that Alvin led was soon a furious disordered ton-end of flying men, trampling each other down in a wild rush back to the town. Job was supported in the rear by a body of spearmen under Abishai, and, seeing how Matthias went, he gave orders for them to come up and file past his own regiment. Then having formed up, Abishai charged the routed army at full speed. On they sped, driving everything before them, on and until they reached the city. Here there was another set of fortified gates, but the rush of the vanquished army was so continuous that they could not be closed, and Abishai with his lancers pushed through into the town along with the fugitives, and Petra was at their mercy. Still, however, at the spot where the other route leading southward branched off near the gate, obstinate fighting continued. an Edomite nobleman, of commanding stature and powerful build, stationed there with a troop of armed foot soldiers, had failed to arrest the charge of Abishai as he swept by at the heels of the retreating Edomites, but when Job reached the spot, he had to submit to a furious attack. A large number of the Israelites were slain, and it almost seemed for a time as if they were to receive a check, so fiercely did the Edomites make their last stand for home and fatherland. They had also the support of Hori, who had rallied a considerable number of his archers, and posted them on a high, rocky shelf immediately above. Reinforcements, however, continued to come up swiftly from the Israelite camp, and in the end these brave men, struggling to the last for Edom, had to yield, but not until 2/3 of them were slain, and their leader so severely wounded that he was made prisoner and reserved for a more horrible fate. Hori and his archers, with the mountains and the open pass behind them, easily made their escape. Meanwhile in the city dreadful scenes of carnage and plunder were being enacted. The whole army of Israel had now entered, securing behind them with strong guards both the passes. The inhabitants consequently found themselves enclosed as in a deadly trap. They fled aimlessly hither and thither, hewn down, as they ran, by the invaders. Many died in the vast caves whose windings led far into the heart of the hills though without any outlet. They had vainly hoped that they might lie there unmolested till the enemy should have relaxed his vigilance. The greater number, however, were too much taken by surprise and had not even time to reach those treacherous refuges, before the enemy was swicarotming into their streets and houses. Job, totally without sympathy for so hard a struggle made by a brave people in defense of their homes, had but one idea: to give them a severe lesson and to take vengeance for the terrible losses his army had sustained. Slaughter, pillage, and burning went on for several successive days, and after a vast pile of booty, gold, silver, brass, armor, weapons, and merchandise had been gathered together, Abishai was sent off with it to King David. Job himself remained. He set himself to an awful but congenial task, the deliberate slaughter of every male in the place. Even this was not done without the frightful severities usual in that day, horrible mutilation and torture being the lot of all who had shown obstinate resistance. For 6 months this gruesome work went on. The caves were thoroughly searched and all fugitives dragged out to a miserable death. Women, children, and boys were spared, but only for slavery. Thus Edom was subdued and trampled underfoot and made desolate. The whole male inhabitants were not however exterminated. Even with his greatest diligence and zeal Job found it impossible to carry out that, in a country so full of wild mountain recesses. But he left Edom securely garrisoned by troops, and those who had escaped his sword dared not cherish the slightest hope of breaking the cruel yoke laid upon them so long as the kingdom of Israel maintained its strength. Yet in their despair the Edomites had one single hope left. Their royal line was not extirpated. It was known that Hadad, the young son of their king, had escaped to the mountains. He would surely live to become at some future day the deliverer of his country if their God had not forsaken his own people and his O/Ti land forever.